Today's headline is Jacob and Ishmael, written by Dr. S.N. Dienard. It says, when Palestine once more becomes the homeland of the Jewish people, the Jews and the Arabs, Jacob and Ishmael, will have reestablished their old, long-forgotten, and long-neglected relationship. The sons of Jacob will once more find themselves almost surrounded by the offspring of Ishmael. Nephew and uncle will have an opportunity of renewing their early acquaintance and friendship and resolving to live happily near each other ever afterward. The close relationship, that of uncle and nephew, between Ishmael and Jacob is attested by historic tradition and linguistic facts. To begin with, we had the patriarchal genealogy of our Bible. Isaac, the father of Jacob, and Ishmael were half-brothers, offspring of the same father, Abraham. True, Ishmael's mother was not of the same race as Isaac's. She was an Egyptian, and originally Abraham's bondwoman, by which the narrator of that Hebrew tradition meant to convey the information that in Ishmael there was not the pure Abrahamic strain, that he was rather of a mixed and inferior breed. The character assigned to him by the Hebrew tradition is in harmony with his alleged morganatic origin. He is described somewhat disparagingly, and he shall be a wild ass of a man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall establish himself in spite of all his brethren. And in another passage we're told, and he dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. When we consider that the recorder of the Hebrew traditions was familiar only with the Arabs who roamed about in the wilderness bordering south and east on Palestine, living the life of freebooters and plunderers, even as the Bedouin Arabs are doing to this day, we can well appreciate this characterization of Ishmael. The Arabs' traditions of their racial genealogy are very much the same as the Hebrews, for as we shall presently see, they derived them from their Hebrew neighbors when they had come into closer contact with them. But they have modified and colored these traditions to make them more complementary to themselves. They admit that they're the descendants of Ishmael, but they refuse to believe that their mother was only a bondwoman. They also maintain that Ishmael, and not Isaac, was chosen by God as a sacrifice to test Abraham's faith. So the traditions of both peoples agree as to their kinship, but their relationship is similarly attested by their speech. Hebrew and Arabic are as closely akin as, let us say, German and Anglo-Saxon, or Italian and Spanish. Hebrews and Arabs evidently spoke the same language before their tribes separated, when the speech of each underwent modifications of its own. More interesting, however, than this racial and linguistic affinity are the intimate relations between the two races in historic times, and the cultural influence each exercised on the other. This takes us back to the time of the beginning of the Jewish dispersion, and away from Palestine, the Jewish homeland. When the children of Judea began their migrations, especially after the downfall of their state, a considerable number of them turned southeastward and settled in that fertile fringe that frames the Arabian desert along the Red Sea. There they soon became completely assimilated with their Arab neighbors, retaining only their faith and their religious traditions. In all other respects, they adopted the life of the natives of Arabia, who soon recognized them as their kindred. They became warlike like the Arabs, building castles on rocky heights for defense, carrying on feuds and forming alliances with neighboring tribes. They loved the martial exercise of arms, and took delight in good-natured rivalry with the sons of Ishmael for the palm of excellent and eloquent and sonorous poetic composition, and art assiduously cultivated by the Arabs of that day. Even a Jewess by the name of Sarah is known as a writer of Arabic verse in those early pre-Mohammedan days. A Jew at that time, warrior as well as singer, has become celebrated in Arabic verse and proverb. As faithful as Al-Samuel has been a proverbial saying among the children of Arabia. The story that gave rise to the proverb is as follows. Emeril Kayes, the most renowned fighter and poet of pre-Islamic Arabia, being beset by enemies on all sides and leaving his native heath in quest of help, left his belongings, among them 5 costly coats of mail and other arms, in the Jewish poet Samuel's castle for safekeeping. One of Emeril Kayes' enemies demanded of Samuel the surrender of those arms, and when refused, laid siege to his castle. He captured one of Samuel's sons, and with the threat of executing him before the very eyes of the father, again demanded the surrender of the arms, and was again refused. He brutally carried out his threat, for Samuel's sense of honor and duty to his friend conquered his affection for his child. Hence the proverb, as faithful as Al-Samuel. The influence of those early Jewish settlers in Arabia went so far that a powerful prince with many of his subjects in southern Arabia became converts to Judaism, so that the chroniclers speak of an Arabian Jewish empire. Large and numerous were the Jewish settlements in and around Medina, the real birthplace of Islam, where its prophet met with his first successes. And it was there also that the Arab Jews met with their first reverses and disasters when Muhammad entered upon his triumphant career. Muhammad's indebtedness to the Jews for what is best in his religion cannot be exaggerated. He repeatedly admits that he is only restoring to the children of Ishmael the faith of their ancestor Abraham. To win the sympathy of the Jews for his new faith, he was willing to make all possible concessions to them and to incorporate into his new religion even many of the traditional rabbinic laws and institutions. He would have his followers turn in prayer toward Jerusalem and observe the Day of Atonement and many of the dietary laws and the historic Jewish Sabbath. But the Jews would have none of him as a prophet, and he in turn revenged himself by adopting the same method of complete separation from Judaism as the church had adopted somewhat earlier. He gave the Jewish idea a different direction, a different time, a different place. The Sabbath was to be observed on Friday, and the faithful were to turn in prayer toward Mecca. Not one day, but a whole month was to be observed in rigorous fasting, etc. But his revenge took a sterner, more punitive form. He resolved upon the expulsion or destruction of the Jewish tribes of Arabia, and he transmitted a legacy of persecuting hate to his followers, which however extended to all unbelievers, Christians as well as Jews. And it was his second successor, the Caliph Omar, who entered upon a vigorous prosecution of his policy, for pushing the conquest of the faithful to remote regions, Egypt, Syria, and Persia. He encountered large Jewish communities everywhere, all equally defiant of the new faith, and so he issued his famous pact. The pact or ordinance of Omar, directed against both Jews and Christians, sounds very much like many a decree in medieval church councils against the Jews. It ordains that Jews and Christians must be distinguished from Mohammedans by certain peculiarities of dress, that they are not to ride horseback nor hold state positions. They are required to pay a poll tax and a land tax and are obliged to entertain any traveling Muslim for 3 days. They are not to build any new churches or synagogues. A Muslim may enter a church or a synagogue whenever he pleases, but a Jew and a Christian may not enter a mosque. On festive days, neither Jews nor Christians may have processions. Their graves are to be level with the ground. They are to pray silently for their dead and are never to sing aloud. Omar expelled the Jews from Khaybar, just as he expelled the Christians from Nurin. For, said he, Muhammad wishes to have only one religion in Arabia. Upon his capture of Jerusalem, the Jews in and around that city naturally fared very badly, for Muhammad had put the seal of holiness on Judea's capital too. Al-Quds, the holy city, is the name by which it is now known in the Mohammedan world. In the meantime, the followers of the Prophet carried their victorious arms to the farthest regions east and west, to Central Asia and the confines of India, to the Strait of Gibraltar and the Pyrenees. At least 2/3 of the world's Jewry were now subjects of the Arab caliphs and emirs, and under Mohammedan Arab influence. At least 2/3 of the world's Jewry now spoke Arabic, a language more quickly and thoroughly mastered by them than the tongues of other European and Asiatic nations, because of its kinship with their own Hebrew. The treatment they received from their Arab rulers and neighbors varied according to the enlightenment and tolerance, or lack of it, that prevailed at a given period and in a given country. When cultured and liberal Arab or Moorish princes held the reins of power, when reason and faith were well balanced, Jews stood in the most cordial relations with their Mohammedan neighbors, and often rose to high positions of trust, dignity, and honor at the courts of their rulers. But when some new fanatical sect or faction was in the ascendancy, such as the Almohades or the Almoravids, all the hostility implanted by the intolerant faith asserted itself, and Jews were often massacred in or banished from Mohammedan lands with the same ruthlessness as was their portion in medieval Christendom. On the whole, however, the periods of toleration and amity exceeded those of blind fanaticism and persecution. That was particularly the case in Moorish Spain. There, for many long periods and in many parts of the country, the Jews enjoyed a degree of felicity that stands out like a brightly illumined spot in the midst of the general medieval darkness all around them. In Mesopotamia, but particularly in Moorish Spain, the native genius of the children of Ishmael bore its noblest fruit. In architecture, in poetry, in science, and in philosophy, the Arabs led the world, as the Greeks had done in the time of Athens' glory. True, it was not entirely the original product of the Arab mind. The Arab built on Greek and Byzantine foundations. The renaissance of Greek learning and Greek thought among the Arabs preceded that in Christendom by centuries. Aristotle was discussed in the schools of Baghdad, Toledo, Cordova, and Cairo long before he became the gospel of Christian scholasticism. But the Arabs also enlarged and enriched the heritage and built nobly on the recovered foundations. Stimulated by this intellectual activity of the Arabs, the Jews in their midst became their keenest rivals. It is from this Arabic-Jewish period that we have the great and brilliant galaxy of medieval Jewish grammarians, exegetes, physicians, astronomers, poets, and philosophers. Almost all medieval Jewish philosophy was written in Arabic and shows the influence of Arab thought. The Jews got their inspiration from the Arabs, just as the Arabs had received theirs from the Greeks. Without surrendering aught of the essentials of their own faith and traditions, the Jewish thinkers sought to reconcile and harmonize Judaism with Greco-Arabic knowledge and thought. Faith and reason, the reason of the time, were to be brought into accord. Similarly, the Jews followed Arab models in the development of the science of their language, Hebrew grammar, and in the form, rhythm, and meter of their poetry. And so, having originally been the awakeners of the Arab intellect in its native habitat, having given the Arabs the best that is in their religion, their racial traditions, their ritualistic practices, such as the Shahida, the Jewish mode of slaughtering cattle for food, and even the religious and legal traditions of which early Jewish converts to Islam were the authors, the Arab mind in turn exercised a powerful influence upon the development of the Jewish intellect during one great period of our history. When the Arabs lost their political and military supremacy, their intellectual powers rapidly declined, and during the last few centuries have suffered a total eclipse. While the Jews in the last 150 years have experienced an intellectual revival that compares very favorably with the most resplendent periods in our history, nay, with the best in the history of mankind. Jacob is once more in a position to stimulate the presently torpid mind of his uncle Ishmael. Will Ishmael take kindly to such stimulation, and will he offer the hand of good fellowship to his nephew? This story comes from the great state of Minnesota, being reported in the American Jewish World of April 9, 1920. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.